The story of Carlo Gambino begins not on the streets of New York, nor in the dimly lit rooms where power would one day be brokered, but in the sun-soaked alleys of Palermo, Sicily, in 1902. Palermo at the turn of the century was a city of contrasts, the sunlight glinting off the cobblestones, the clamor of merchants calling their wares, and the laughter of children playing in the piazzas. Yet, beneath this lively exterior, there was a quiet tension, a shadow that lingered in the back streets and narrow lanes, a legacy of a world governed as much by whispers as by law. Carlo was born into a modest family, the youngest child of a struggling household. His father worked hard, a man of quiet strength and simple habits, while his mother managed the home with stern resolve. The Gambino family was not wealthy, but they were respected in their neighborhood, largely because they understood the unspoken rules of Sicilian life: respect, loyalty, and caution. Even as a boy, Carlo displayed a calmness that set him apart. He was not the type to fight or shout, nor was he easily intimidated. Where other children rushed headlong into trouble, Carlo watched, absorbed every detail, and measured every reaction. His eyes, dark and observant, seemed to see far more than he revealed. It was a trait that would later define him, a natural talent for reading people in situations without revealing his own intentions. Life in Palermo was not easy. The city's narrow streets offered both opportunity and danger. Young boys learned early the precarious balance of life in a place where honor mattered as much as courage. Carlo learned these lessons not in classrooms, but in the streets, observing disputes, noting how a simple word could ignite a fight or avert one, how the right gesture earned respect while the wrong one invited trouble. By the age of 10, he understood the subtle language of power, the quiet diplomacy that governed human behavior, and the patience required to survive in a world where impulsiveness could be fatal. The Gambino family, like many Sicilian families of the era, dreamed of a better life beyond the island. In 1921, when Carlo was 19, that dream became reality. Economic hardship and the promise of opportunity drew them across the Atlantic to the United States. They settled in New York, a city brimming with ambition, energy, and peril. Immigrants crowded into the tenements of Brooklyn and Manhattan, and the streets were a melting pot of cultures, languages, and conflicts. For Carlo, America was both promise and challenge. The crowded neighborhoods were rife with opportunity, but opportunity often carried a price. It was in this environment that he first became acquainted with the organized structures of crime, not as a spectacle, but as a reality of survival and influence. He observed the older gangsters, men who commanded fear and respect with quiet authority, and he noted the rules that governed these shadowed worlds. Unlike many who sought power through flamboyance or aggression, Carlo recognized the potency of discretion, patience, and intelligence. Life in New York was not gentle. The streets were crowded, noisy, and often violent. Immigrants faced prejudice, economic hardship, and the constant threat of exploitation. For a young man like Carlo, survival demanded both caution and ambition. He took on small jobs in the neighborhood, but always kept an eye on the larger structures around him. He watched, he listened, and he learned. It was during these years that Carlo began to cultivate the habits and skills that would later define him. He learned to negotiate with subtlety, to wield influence without confrontation, and to maintain a reputation without ostentation. Every encounter, every conversation, every observation was a lesson. Carlo Gambino was building an understanding of power that few could match, an understanding rooted not in bravado, but in quiet mastery. By the late 1920s, Carlo had made his first tentative steps into the world of organized crime. He aligned himself with small gangs, worked with individuals who respected patience and discretion, and avoided unnecessary conflict. These were formative years. Alliances were forged, reputations established, and his talent for reading people became more acute. He understood the value of loyalty, the danger of betrayal, and the necessity of appearing calm even in the face of threat. While many of his contemporaries sought fame and notoriety through violence or spectacle, Carlo Gambino remained in the shadows. His strength lay in his silence, in his ability to act without being seen, to influence without being noticed. This approach allowed him to navigate a world fraught with danger while avoiding the pitfalls that claimed so many of his peers. Even as he began to rise, Carlo retained the traits that had defined his youth: patience, observation, and an almost uncanny ability to assess character. These qualities would become the foundation of his empire. While others relied on fear or brute force, Gambino understood that true power was earned quietly through respect, loyalty, and the careful orchestration of influence. The streets of New York were a far cry from the sunlit alleys of Palermo, yet the lessons he had learned in Sicily served him well. Life was a game of observation, patience, and strategy. Every alliance had its cost, every decision carried consequences, and every whisper could carry danger. Carlo Gambino had entered this world not as a warrior, but as a strategist, a silent observer who would one day shape the very landscape of organized crime in America. In these early years, the foundations of the Silent King were being laid. The boy who watched from the shadows, who spoke only when necessary, who calculated every move before acting, was growing into a man who would one day command fear and respect in equal measure. His journey had only begun, but the traits that would define his legacy, silence, patience, cunning, and control were already unmistakable. The story of Carlo Gambino is not one of flashy violence or dramatic showdowns. It is the story of quiet power, of intelligence wielded with patience, and of a man who understood that true influence is rarely loud. It is silent, steady, and absolute. The streets of New York in the late 1920s were a maze of opportunity, danger, and unspoken rules. Immigrant communities, crowded and restless, were fertile ground for ambition and crime alike. For Carlo Gambino, the city was both a challenge and a canvas, an environment that demanded patience, intelligence, and an understanding of human nature. Unlike many of his peers, Carlo did not seek the spotlight. The boisterous, violent gangs that dominated neighborhoods were a lesson in what not to do. Noise drew attention, impulsiveness invited trouble. Carlo observed these men carefully, noting their successes and, more importantly, their failures. He understood that to survive and prosper in the underworld, one needed to operate like a chess player, each move deliberate, each alliance considered, every risk calculated. By the late 1920s, Carlo began taking small, strategic steps into the criminal world. He worked initially as an intermediary, delivering messages, collecting debts, and acting as a discreet enforcer. These roles required subtlety rather than aggression, discretion rather than spectacle. In every task, Carlo demonstrated patience, reliability, and a calm intelligence that quickly earned him a reputation among the local crime networks. He did not boast, nor did he provoke enemies. Instead, he built trust quietly, becoming a man whose word carried weight because it was seldom broken. It was during this period that Carlo began to forge connections with older, more experienced mobsters. These men were impressed not by his youth or ambition, but by his composure and perceptiveness. Unlike the brash, quick-tempered young men who often burned through opportunities, Carlo Gambino understood the power of observation. He watched rivalries, measured alliances, and learned the delicate balance between loyalty and self-preservation. One of his earliest mentors, a seasoned gangster with deep roots in the Sicilian tradition, recognized Carlo's potential immediately. He taught him the unspoken rules of organized crime: when to act, when to wait, and the value of patience in consolidating influence. Under this guidance, Carlo learned the subtle art of negotiation, the importance of silence, and the quiet assertion of authority, skills that would later define his leadership style. By the early 1930s, prohibition was reshaping New York's criminal landscape. Illegal alcohol created immense opportunity and fierce competition. Carlo recognized that overt violence and flashy attacks were distractions. The real power lay in control, discretion, and long-term strategy. While rival gangs sought dominance through public displays of force, Gambino worked behind the scenes, arranging alliances, mediating disputes, and expanding his network of influence. His first ventures into higher-level operations involved gambling and bookmaking. These enterprises demanded trust and management rather than brute strength. Carlo approached them like a businessman, calculating profits, managing risk, and keeping a low profile. Unlike other mobsters, he avoided unnecessary confrontations with law enforcement, relying instead on careful organization, bribery, and subtle influence. Alliances were the cornerstone of his rise. Carlo understood that loyalty was earned through respect, not fear alone. He cultivated relationships with influential figures in the mafia and beyond, forming a network of connections that would support him in future years. Some of these alliances were temporary, strategic in nature. Others would last decades, binding the underworld together with the invisible threads of trust and mutual benefit. By the mid-1930s, Carlo's reputation had grown. He was no longer a quiet observer. He had become a man whose counsel was sought and whose decisions carried weight. Yet, he remained cautious. Unlike others who sought power through intimidation or spectacle, Gambino continued to operate in the shadows, allowing his influence to grow silently while avoiding unnecessary exposure. He also understood the importance of timing. Opportunities in organized crime often arose unexpectedly, and success depended on recognizing the right moment to act. Carlo waited, often for years, before making moves that would advance his position. This patience was his greatest weapon. While rivals rushed into action, sometimes with disastrous consequences, Gambino's careful calculations ensured that his steps were deliberate, measured, and almost always successful. During this period, he became involved in the internal politics of the New York Mafia families. The landscape was fragmented, a delicate balance of power maintained through diplomacy, intimidation, and, when necessary, violence. Carlo observed these dynamics closely, learning who could be trusted, who was expendable, and when alliances could be leveraged to his advantage. He became known for his intelligence, his discretion, and his uncanny ability to predict the outcomes of complex interactions. By the late 1930s, Carlo Gambino had emerged as a rising figure in the underworld. He had learned the value of silence, patience, and strategic foresight. He had cultivated alliances and earned a reputation for intelligence and reliability. And most importantly, he had established the foundation for the empire he would one day command. Yet, even as he ascended, he remained invisible to the public eye. While other mobsters sought fame, notoriety, or the fear of their enemies, Carlo Gambino understood that true power was quiet. Influence, respect, and control could be wielded without drawing attention. The streets of New York, filled with danger and opportunity, were the perfect proving ground for his skills. It was in these years that the first seeds of his legacy were sown, the understanding that leadership was not about noise, aggression, or flash. It was about calculation, patience, and the subtle management of people and resources. Carlo Gambino was building more than a reputation. He was constructing a framework for an empire, one that would survive not just through fear, but through loyalty, intelligence, and strategic mastery. By the end of the 1930s, Carlo had firmly established himself within the ranks of the New York Mafia. He was trusted, respected, and quietly feared, though few understood the full extent of his influence. The Silent King was emerging, his empire still invisible to the casual observer, yet already formidable. The stage was set. Carlo Gambino's rise had been deliberate, calculated, and patient. He had survived the treacherous streets of Palermo, adapted to the chaos of New York, and learned the rules of the criminal underworld. But the true test of his skill, the consolidation of power, and the maneuvering that would place him at the pinnacle of the American Mafia was only just beginning. The next decade would define him, the alliances he would forge, the rivals he would outmaneuver, and the empire he would quietly construct. The story of Carlo Gambino's rise is not a tale of violence or spectacle, but of intelligence, patience, and the silent accumulation of power, a story of a man who understood that the shadows often hold more strength than the spotlight. By the 1940s, Carlo Gambino had moved beyond the cautious apprenticeship of his youth. He was no longer the silent observer at the edges of the underworld. He had become a man whose influence shaped the very structures of organized crime in New York. But unlike many of his contemporaries, his ascent was measured, deliberate, and almost imperceptible. He wielded power not through spectacle, but through precision, patience, and the quiet orchestration of alliances. The streets of New York had changed. Prohibition had ended, but the world of organized crime did not retreat. It adapted. Gambling, loan sharking, narcotics, extortion, and labor racketeering became the new frontiers. Carlo understood that control over these enterprises was not a matter of force alone. It required management, intelligence, and the ability to read people as precisely as a chess player anticipates his opponent's moves. Gambino's rise to power was anchored in this intelligence. He carefully selected associates, cultivating men who were loyal, discreet, and competent. He avoided the flashy displays of violence that drew law enforcement attention or public scrutiny. Violence, for Carlo, was a tool, not a lifestyle. When necessary, it was applied with surgical precision; otherwise, it was unnecessary noise. One of his earliest strategies involved consolidating influence within the fragmented Italian-American families. The Mafia was not a single entity. It was a complex network of factions, each vying for control, each susceptible to internal betrayal. Carlo's genius lay in his understanding of these dynamics. He cultivated loyalty, brokered alliances, and quietly undermined rivals without ever appearing overtly aggressive. His moves were invisible to the casual observer, yet devastatingly effective. During these years, Carlo's operations expanded significantly. Gambling dens, illegal lotteries, and bookmaking enterprises became the backbone of his growing empire. He managed these ventures like a meticulous businessman, ensuring that profits were maximized while exposure to law enforcement remained minimal. Corruption was his ally. Police officers, judges, and politicians could be persuaded with the right combination of incentives and subtle threats. Carlo Gambino's influence reached beyond the underworld into the public institutions that attempted to contain it. Yet it was not only business acumen that defined his power, it was psychological mastery. Carlo had an uncanny ability to assess character, anticipate betrayal, and neutralize threats before they could escalate. Rival mobsters underestimated him at their peril. While others relied on fear or reputation, Gambino relied on understanding, patience, and a strategic application of force. The early 1950s marked a turning point in his career. The Mafia's structure was shifting, with alliances forming and dissolving as old bosses died or were imprisoned. Carlo Gambino seized the moment, orchestrating the strategic removal of rivals and positioning himself as a mediator and leader. One by one, obstacles fell, not always through violence, but often through careful negotiation, leverage, and the subtle use of intimidation. He understood the psychology of power, control the environment, anticipate the moves of others, and act decisively when the moment demanded it. Betrayal was a constant in this world. Carlo experienced it, witnessed it, and learned from it. But he never reacted impulsively. When an associate showed signs of disloyalty, Carlo assessed the risk, determined the potential gain or loss, and chose his response with cold calculation. Sometimes the punishment was swift and severe. Other times he waited, letting the situation evolve until the optimal moment for action arrived. This patience became a hallmark of his leadership. One of the most defining aspects of Gambino's rise was his approach to internal power struggles. Unlike other mob bosses, he did not seek to dominate through fear alone. Instead, he cultivated respect, understanding that a loyal network was more valuable than a frightened one. Men who worked under him were rewarded for discretion, loyalty, and competence. Betrayal was met with consequences, but the expectation of loyalty was clear and consistently enforced. Carlo Gambino's empire was as much psychological as it was operational. Structure held together by trust, fear, and strategic influence. By the mid-1950s, Carlo's power was undeniable. He had positioned himself at the pinnacle of the New York Mafia, controlling key operations while maintaining a public profile almost entirely absent from the violent headlines that characterized other crime figures. The press rarely mentioned him, law enforcement struggled to trace his influence, and rival bosses quietly acknowledged his dominance. He was, in every sense, the silent king. Yet even in his most secure moments, Carlo Gambino remained vigilant. The world of organized crime was inherently unstable. Alliances could fracture, associates could betray, and law enforcement pressures could strike unexpectedly. He maintained a network of loyal men, discreet informants, and carefully monitored operations, ensuring that his empire could survive both internal and external threats. Power, however, was not merely a measure of wealth or control, it was a measure of influence over people. Carlo Gambino understood this better than most. He could sway decisions, manipulate outcomes, and maintain order without raising his voice. His ability to command respect silently, to exert control invisibly, became his most potent weapon. During this period, Carlo also navigated relationships with other families and crime syndicates. National coordination among the mafia required diplomacy, strategic marriages, and the careful negotiation of disputes. Gambino excelled in this arena. He brokered deals, mediated conflicts, and positioned himself as an indispensable figure in the national network. His empire was not just local, it was connected, influential, and respected across the United States. Despite his growing power, Carlo Gambino remained cautious. He avoided unnecessary exposure, eschewed flamboyance, and relied on his ability to calculate risks. He understood that visibility could invite danger, and that patience often yielded greater rewards than immediate action. His style of leadership, quiet, intelligent, and deliberate, was unmatched in the annals of American organized crime. By the late 1950s, Carlo Gambino had become the architect of one of the most stable and powerful mafia empires in history. He had outmaneuvered rivals, consolidated operations, and earned the unwavering loyalty of his associates. His rise was not marked by spectacular violence, but by strategy, discretion, and an almost surgical understanding of human behavior. Yet, even at the height of his influence, Carlo Gambino knew that power was never permanent. Every empire faced threats, external pressures from law enforcement, internal disputes, and the constant specter of betrayal. His next challenge would be to maintain his dominance, navigate shifting allegiances, and ensure that the Silent King's reign endured. This period of his life, the consolidation of power, the management of crime enterprises, and the handling of betrayal, set the stage for Carlo Gambino's ultimate legacy. The man who had started as a quiet observer in Palermo had become a master strategist, a ruler whose influence extended far beyond the streets of New York. The empire he built in silence would define an era. It was not an empire of spectacle, but of subtlety, intelligence, and precision. And it was a testament to the philosophy that had guided him from childhood, that true power is quiet, patient, and absolute. By the 1960s, Carlo Gambino had firmly established himself as the silent king of the American Mafia. His empire spanned across New York, reaching into other parts of the country, influencing unions, gambling operations, and illicit enterprises with a subtle yet unshakable authority. But the higher a man rises in the shadows, the sharper the knives become. Power, while intoxicating, is never secure. And for a man like Gambino, the real challenge was not achieving supremacy, it was maintaining it. The criminal landscape of New York was evolving. Law enforcement agencies were becoming more sophisticated, with federal investigations targeting organized crime at every level. The FBI, the local police, and the IRS had begun to understand that mafia empires thrived not on violence alone, but on networks, influence, and financial control. For Carlo, these new pressures required adaptation, discretion, and constant vigilance. He strengthened his internal network, placing loyal men in positions of power throughout his operations. Each associate was carefully vetted for loyalty, discretion, and competence. Gambino understood that the survival of his empire depended as much on internal stability as on avoiding law enforcement scrutiny. No empire, no matter how quietly ruled, could survive if its foundation of loyalty cracked. Yet even the most disciplined organizations faced challenges from within. The mafia was a world of ambition, where younger men often grew restless under the control of a patient and calculating leader. Carlo dealt with these challenges as he had learned to deal with all threats, quietly, strategically, and decisively. Rumors of betrayal were investigated with precision, disloyal associates were neutralized before they could become real dangers. Sometimes this required subtle persuasion, other times more permanent solutions were necessary. But always, Carlo ensured that his hand remained unseen, his control undisputed. External threats were equally pressing. Rival families, some still bitter from past disputes, tested the limits of his influence. Gambino understood the delicate dance of negotiation, intimidation, and patience required to maintain supremacy. Alliances were reinforced, tensions diffused, and enemies were reminded, without fanfare, that crossing the silent king carried consequences. He did not rely on overt displays of power. His presence alone, the careful orchestration of influence, was often enough to command obedience. The 1960s also brought the national mafia commission into focus. Carlo Gambino was a central figure, respected by peers across the country, yet with respect came responsibility and scrutiny. Decisions made at the commission had consequences for his empire and for the broader underworld. Gambino navigated these waters with the same strategic mind that had guided him from Palermo to New York. He was measured, calculating, and patient, understanding that a single misstep could unravel decades of careful work. Despite these pressures, Gambino maintained an aura of calm control. Unlike many of his contemporaries, he avoided unnecessary conflict, opting instead for careful negotiation and subtle influence. His power was psychological as much as operational. Men obeyed because they respected him, feared him, and understood that his reach extended beyond immediate threats. The Silent King's greatest strength was his ability to shape outcomes without ever raising his voice or appearing confrontational. Yet, even a man as disciplined as Carlo Gambino was not immune to vulnerability. The combination of age, law enforcement pressure, and the natural entropy of human ambition created cracks that demanded constant attention. He responded as he always had, quietly, decisively, and strategically. He reinforced alliances, reassured loyal associates, and subtly removed those whose presence could threaten stability. His empire remained intact, a testament to decades of patience, intelligence, and unwavering control. The later years of Gambino's life also reflected a keen understanding of legacy. Unlike men who sought notoriety or fame, Carlo Gambino focused on succession, ensuring that the structures he had built could endure beyond his own presence. Leadership was distributed carefully, responsibilities delegated to trusted lieutenants who understood the value of discretion and patience. His foresight ensured that, even as time progressed and pressures mounted, his influence would persist. Throughout these years, Carlo Gambino remained largely invisible to the public eye. While law enforcement occasionally targeted his operations and journalists speculated on his activities, he continued to operate with minimal exposure. Unlike the more flamboyant crime figures who courted headlines, Gambino understood that silence was safety, and discretion was power. His greatest victories were those that went unnoticed, the subtle manipulations and careful orchestration that allowed his empire to thrive without fanfare. As he aged, Gambino became almost mythical among his peers. He was respected, feared, and revered, not for flashy violence or dramatic showdowns, but for his intelligence, patience, and mastery of human nature. Men who had once doubted him learned to defer, understanding that his calm gaze concealed a mind that was always calculating, always prepared, always ahead. In many ways, Carlo Gambino's legacy was already secured during these later years. He had survived rivalries, navigated betrayals, and maintained control over an empire that spanned decades. His influence extended beyond New York, shaping the broader landscape of organized crime in America. Yet, he remained humble in appearance, a man of quiet routines, preferring to avoid unnecessary attention while ensuring that the machinery of his empire continued to operate smoothly. The challenges of the later years were many: external threats from law enforcement, internal pressures from ambitious subordinates, and the inevitability of aging. But Gambino's approach never wavered. Patience, observation, and strategic action remained his guiding principles. He understood that true power was not measured by temporary victories or displays of force, but by stability, longevity, and the silent loyalty of those around him. By the end of the 1960s and into the 1970s, Carlo Gambino had not only preserved his empire, he had perfected it. His influence was unmatched, his control undisputed, and his reputation as the Silent King solidified. The empire he had built was a monument to patience, intelligence, and strategic foresight. He had learned from Palermo, adapted to New York, and outmaneuvered every challenge the underworld had presented. And yet, even in his final years, Gambino's story was not one of sensational violence or public spectacle. It was a story of quiet mastery, of the subtle exercise of power, and of a man who understood that the shadows often conceal the greatest strength. His legacy was not measured in headlines or notoriety, but in the enduring influence of an empire that thrived under the rule of a man who never needed to shout to be heard. Carlo Gambino's later years were a testament to the philosophy that had guided him from his youth, that true power is patient, calculated, and absolute. The threats of betrayal, law enforcement, and ambition were ever present, yet he navigated them with a mastery few could rival. The Silent King had survived not by force alone, but by intellect, discretion, and an unwavering understanding of human nature. By the late 1970s, Carlo Gambino had spent decades navigating the treacherous corridors of power in the American underworld. His empire, carefully constructed over decades of patience, intelligence, and calculated action, remained one of the most stable and influential in the history of organized crime. Unlike others who courted notoriety or lived for headlines, Gambino's strength lay in silence, subtlety, and foresight. The streets, the back rooms, and the quiet offices of New York knew his name as a measure of authority, a presence felt even when unseen. Despite his considerable power, Carlo Gambino aged with the same quiet dignity he had brought to every aspect of his life. The years of meticulous planning, strategic patience, and careful management of both allies and rivals allowed him to maintain stability within his empire. Unlike many mob bosses whose later years were marred by violence or law, enforcement pressure, Gambino managed to protect his network, ensuring that loyalty remained steadfast and operations continued without disruption. Yet, even the Silent King could not escape the inevitability of mortality. Health, age, and the unrelenting pressures of life in the shadows gradually took their toll. Gambino's later years were spent balancing the maintenance of his empire with the slow contemplation of his legacy. He was acutely aware that while empires can outlast their founders, the men who build them do not. His focus shifted increasingly toward succession and preservation, ensuring that the structures he had painstakingly assembled could endure beyond his own presence. Carlo Gambino's death on October 15, 1976, was emblematic of the life he had lived, quiet, controlled, and largely unnoticed by the public eye. He passed away from natural causes, leaving behind an empire that few outsiders fully understood. Unlike the violent deaths that claimed so many of his contemporaries, Gambino's departure was serene, a reflection of a life led with restraint and strategic mastery. The Silent King had exited the stage as quietly as he had ruled it, leaving a void that few were equipped to fill. His passing triggered subtle shifts within the Mafia. Associates, rivals, and successors all felt the absence of his steady hand. Decisions that once relied on his judgment now required careful navigation, and the balance he had maintained so delicately faced the natural pressures of change. Yet, the structures he had built, the networks of loyalty, influence, and strategic alliances, remained intact, a testament to his foresight and skill. Carlo Gambino's enduring legacy is not measured in sensational headlines or cinematic dramatizations of violence. It is measured in stability, intelligence, and the subtle orchestration of power. He proved that dominance in the underworld does not require spectacle. It requires strategy, patience, and an understanding of human nature that few possess. His influence extended beyond New York, shaping the operations and politics of organized crime across the United States. The principles that guided Gambino, discretion, observation, loyalty, and calculated action, became a blueprint for future generations of mobsters. His ability to consolidate power quietly, avoid unnecessary conflict, and manage both human and operational networks with precision remains a defining example of strategic leadership in the criminal world. Historians, criminologists, and organized crime analysts often regard Carlo Gambino as the epitome of the strategic mob boss. He was not the man of fiery tempers, loud displays, or impulsive decisions. He was the man who understood that influence is most potent when it is invisible, and control is most absolute when it appears effortless. The Silent King's empire endured because he prioritized stability over spectacle, foresight over impulse, and loyalty over fear. Even decades after his death, the echoes of Carlo Gambino's reign continue to resonate in the annals of organized crime. The structures he put in place, the networks he cultivated, and the principles he embodied left an indelible mark on the mafia. New York's underworld, and indeed the national criminal landscape, was forever shaped by his quiet mastery. In reflecting on Carlo Gambino's life, it becomes clear that his genius lay not in the audacity of his actions, but in their subtlety. The empire he built, the loyalty he commanded, and the respect he earned were all products of a mind that understood patience, calculation, and the true nature of power. His story is a testament to the idea that greatness does not always announce itself with fanfare. Sometimes it moves silently, strategically, and indelibly, just like the man himself. Carlo Gambino, the silent king of the American Mafia, remains a figure whose life is studied not for the bloodshed it caused, but for the intelligence, restraint, and quiet authority that defined it. His legacy is a reminder that the most formidable power is often exercised not through noise and violence, but through patience, strategy, and an unshakable understanding of human nature. The empire he left behind was a reflection of his life, controlled, disciplined, and enduring. And though the man himself has passed into history, the lessons of his reign continue to echo through the corridors of the underworld. He once ruled with a quiet, unassailable mastery. Carlo Gambino's story is a story of patience over impulse, of intellect over violence, of the silent accumulation of power over the fleeting drama of notoriety. In the quiet shadows, he remains, as he always was, the silent king,